All right. So we're going to look now at the Pastoral Epistles, which, again, these are attributed to Paul, but they actually don't come from Paul. So just to summarize where we are at this point in the course, we've looked at three Deutero-Pauline epistles attributed to Paul, but really aren't from Paul: Second Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. So remember, there are 13 letters in the New Testament that say they are written by Paul. Modern scholars and historians think 7 of these are written by Paul: Romans, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, these are 2 different letters, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon, and Philippians. There are 3 that are classified as Deutero-Paul, so that's 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. And then you have 3 more to make up 13, and these are the pastoral epistles: 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And we've also talked about all the reasons, I'm not going to go back into them, as to why Paul didn't write Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, and here we're going to talk a bit about why Paul didn't write 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. It's important, though, to remember, to keep in mind, that the question here is not whether Christians in antiquity forged documents in the name of the apostles. We know that's what they did. That is, for me and for most historians, it's the simplest Occam's razor explanation. And if we had time in a course like this, but we don't, we could go through all sorts of apocalyptic literature that was allegedly written in the names of people like Peter and Paul. We've already gone through some Gospels supposedly written by Thomas, by Peter, but there are others that claim to be written by Bartholomew and even Mary Magdalene. These are forgeries. And then there are letters, all kinds of letters that are forged in the names of famous Christians. There are letters, if you read in Ehrman's textbook, there's a whole set of letters that are complete forgeries of letters between Paul and Seneca. There's a 3rd Corinthians. There are even letters out there, forgeries, that claim they were written by Jesus himself. Well, what we're doing here with Deutero-Paul and the pastoral epistles is we are questioning specific cases of forgery. Was a particular document written by its alleged author, and did this document make its way into the canon of the New Testament? That's the question we're asking. In the Deutero-Paulines, what we concluded is that yes, it appears that later disciples of Paul wrote these letters in his name. And again, that is not a big deal in antiquity. They wrote these letters in his name, they addressed problems in various communities that had arisen, and they claimed not their own authority, but they claimed the authority of their revered teacher. And as I told you, this is exactly what a follower of a famous philosopher would have done in the ancient world. So as much as all of this might bother us, it doesn't bother anyone in the ancient world. Well, something very similar to the Deutero-Paulines is going on in these 3 letters, the pastoral epistles, known as 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. These short letters, which scholars call the pastoral epistles, are called the pastoral epistles because what they do is they provide very basic information and instruction to pastors on how to execute their pastoral responsibilities. Now, more and more, even among conservative evangelical scholars and conservative Catholic scholars, more and more critical scholars all across the spectrum are coming to the conclusion that there is no way the pastoral epistles were written by Paul. And we'll get into several reasons for that later on here, but even more than Deutero-Paul, scholars are convinced and have been convinced for some time that Paul could not possibly have written 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. So what we'll do is we'll begin discussing the pastoral epistles by considering these 3 letters as a group. It seems fairly clear that whoever authored these letters wrote them as a group. They were meant to be read together. The author was likely a Greek-speaking Christian who had some kind of education. And the reason I say they were written to be read together is because both 1 and 2 Timothy are addressed to the same person and are very similar in terms of style. For example, if you just look at the opening few verses of 1 Timothy and then of 2 Timothy, you realize these are two letters basically addressing the same individual, and many of the same themes are covered. Titus almost looks like it's an abstract of 1 Timothy. Many scholars have said it's sort of the Cliff Notes or the Reader's Digest version of 1 Timothy. It's the summary. So each one of these letters, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, they're written to a pastor of a large Christian community. Timothy is supposedly the pastor of a church in Ephesus, Titus of the church on the Isle of Crete. So these are Greek letters written by a Greek-speaking Christian claiming to be Paul, likely to other Greek-speaking Christians or Greek-speaking pastors. Timothy in Ephesus, Titus on the Isle of Crete. Each letter deals with slightly different situations, but fortunately, the major issues are the same. What's happened is false teachers have begun to create problems for the congregations that Timothy oversees and the congregations that Titus oversees. And these communities are suffering from internal problems of disorganization. In other words, all kinds of issues are going on here with leadership problems. Who's in charge, who's not? The letters themselves urge the pastors, Timothy and Titus, to take control of things. The writer of these letters tells Timothy and Titus, you need to run a tighter ship. You need to keep everyone in line. You need to exercise your authority. And above all, you need to silence anyone in your communities who are promoting ideas that conflict with the ideas of the author of the Pastoral Epistles. So it's as if the author of the Pastoral Epistles is saying, what I'm writing is right. What I'm writing is orthodoxy. And anyone who doesn't agree with this, they're false and they should be silenced. One of the prominent instructions involves the heretical teachings of the author's opponents. And the author of the Pastoral Epistles is not kind at all when he describes his opponents. He describes them in very caustic, very harsh tones and language. He calls his opponents lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, profligates, brutes, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure, and the list goes on and on and on. But in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 through 5, this is how the author of the Pastoral Epistles describes these opponents. These are the people Timothy and Titus need to silence. Now, it could be that the opponents were, in fact, all of these things and more. But what's puzzling with the Pastoral Epistles is that the author of these three letters never indicates what the opponents were teaching that made him think this way about them. He never says what they're saying that's so offensive. Nor does he indicate why what they teach is wrong. Apparently, the author assumes this is something Timothy knows, this is something Titus knows. In fact, the pastors, Timothy and Titus, are not to have any serious discussions with these opponents, with these teachers who are teaching the wrong things. They're not really even supposed to work out the differences. They're just to silence them. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, the author tells Timothy, you need to bring these false teachers into submission. Again, get them in line. Now, this doesn't really seem like Paul when you think about it. Back in Romans, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Paul typically marshals his arguments against wrong teachings. I mean, he lays out a case of here's what they're saying and here's why it's wrong. But this is not what the author of the Pastoral Epistles does. Well, throughout the letters, again, reading in between the lines, there may be some indications that the teachers, these false opponents, these false teachers, were Gnostics. Whoever these individuals were, they appear to subscribe to what the author refers to as, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20, the contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. That's that Greek word gnosis. Secret knowledge, all that sort of stuff the Gnostics believed in, and prominent in the Gospel of Thomas. And like Gnostics, they seem to be particularly enthralled with myths and endless genealogies of the gods, which the author talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 4. If this is the case, and I actually do think it is the case, this indicates that the author is writing in a period much, much later than Paul, because Gnosticism didn't exist when Paul was alive. It hadn't taken root in Paul's day. This is why a lot of scholars, including myself, say you need to push the pastoral epistles into the 2nd century, because it looks like the problem here is Gnosticism. The author then is concerned that the churches represented in Ephesus and on the Isle of Crete, the author is concerned that they appoint proper leaders. In both 1 Timothy and Titus, the author of the pastoral epistles gives all of this detailed instruction concerning the qualifications of bishops, priests, and deacons. These bishops and deacons, they are the ones who are supposed to have charge of the church's physical and spiritual well-being. No one else. They're to be seasoned Christians with upright moral lives. They are to be Christians who know how to control their own households and have good reputations on the outside. If you want to look through a list of what these leaders are supposed to be, you can look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and read the first 13 verses. There Paul gives, or the author of the pastoral epistles gives, a list of his qualifications for what it means to be a bishop, etc., in the church. So if we're to look at these church leaders, one of the things that's so striking is that the author of the pastoral epistles says these leaders must all be men. In fact, the author goes so far as to say women are to have no leadership roles in the church whatsoever. In fact, they're not even to speak in church. They are to remain silent. If they have questions, they can simply ask their husbands when they go back home. In one of the most infamous passages of the New Testament that's caused so many problems for women in Christianity, the author of the pastoral epistles explains, and this is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. The author explains that women are descended from the biblical Eve, of Adam and Eve. Eve was deceived by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, which Christians are thinking of as the devil. She ate the forbidden fruit, and because of her disobedience, she brought sin into the world. And then she had the gall to dupe her husband Adam into doing the exact same thing. The author of the pastoral epistles concludes that if women are allowed to lead, they will be deceived by the devil. And they will deceive their husbands, and they will lead their husbands into sin and ruin. Therefore, women are to be silent in church. And then one of the strangest comments in the New Testament, again, appearing here in 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 15, is that women will be saved through the act of bearing children. Again, if you want to know where all of the really bad stuff about women in Christianity comes from, it really comes from this Paul of the Pastoral Epistles. So there are compelling reasons for thinking that Paul didn't write 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. On the micro level, if we just look at the words themselves, this would be so much easier to do if you were looking at 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus in Greek, but on the micro level of the words themselves, the vocabulary of the pastoral epistles speaks completely against their authenticity. So let me give you a brief example of this. Suppose someone were to uncover a letter allegedly written by Paul that urged its readers to attend Mass every Saturday night, go to confession twice a week, and say 3 Hail Marys for every unintentional sin. Well, if you uncovered a letter that looked ancient and written in Greek that said that, you would probably conclude there's no way Paul would have ever written that, because how in the world would Paul know anything about the Catholic Church, the Catholic Mass, Catholic confession, and saying Hail Marys? They don't exist in the time of Paul. But if we go even further with this, the very vocabulary of the pastoral epistles, as well as the concepts expressed by this vocabulary, are ideas and words that developed long after the time of Paul. Nothing like Paul saying, say Hail Marys. Nothing like that so striking as that occurs in the pastorals, but the vocabulary is non-Pauline. What I mean by that is if you look at the 848 different words found in the pastoral epistles, 306 of those Greek words occur nowhere else in the Pauline writings found in the New Testament. And this includes the Deutero-Pauline letters. So there are 848 vocabulary words in the pastoral epistles. 306 of those you cannot find in Romans, Galatians, etc., and then in Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. What this means is 2/3 of the vocabulary words in the Deutero-Paulines are non-Pauline words. But if you look at the literature of 2nd century Christianity, a lot of those words appear in Christian writers from the early to mid 2nd century. And again, this is another reason why scholars think, well, maybe these letters should be pushed into the 2nd century. But beyond things like vocabulary, what's even more striking is that some words are found in the pastorals and in Paul, but they have completely different definitions. Just to give you one small example of this. Faith, that word faith, it's there in the authentic letters of Paul, it's there in Deutero-Paul, it's also in the pastoral epistles. Faith no longer in the pastoral epistles refers to a trusting acceptance of Christ's death for your sins. It's no longer a relational term. It's not about you believing in Jesus' death and resurrection and then you are saved. Instead, if you look at Titus chapter 1, verse 13, it refers to the body of teaching that makes up the true faith or the true religion. It's gone from being a relational term to being a propositional term. So suddenly, when you get to the pastoral epistles, faith is a body of teaching that makes up the religion. That is not at all how Paul used it, which tells you a great deal of time has had to pass from Paul to a time in early Christianity when there was a body of teaching that makes up the faith. More striking are the differences in the historical situation that's presupposed by these letters. And it's striking when you compare the historical situation of the pastoral epistles to Paul's historical context and the way he responded to it. Now, we've already discussed the issue of Gnosticism, and we've discussed it in terms of the time of its emergence in the early Christian church. It just wasn't there when Paul was writing his authentic letters. The pastoral epistles presuppose that some form of Gnosticism is alive and well in the church. But these letters also presuppose that there is now in the church an established hierarchy of authority. Like I said, there's this understanding that there are bishops, priests, deacons, but none of this hierarchy is mentioned in Paul's day. If you look at 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, or Titus, each one of these letters assumes there is one male leader of the church, of these churches. They also assume that there are groups of bishops and deacons serving under this one leader. Now, if you go back and think about 1 Corinthians, you can contrast the pastoral epistles with what Paul has to say in 1 Corinthians about leadership. In 1 Corinthians, which is riddled with all kinds of problems, you don't find this type of established church leadership. If you did, it would have made sense for Paul to write to the Corinthians and say, look, go ask your pastor, go ask your bishop what you need to do or why what you're doing is wrong. Well, it's really simple when you think about it. In 1 Corinthians, there is no pastor. There is no one head of the church. In Paul's authentic letters, his churches of the decade from 50 to 60 CE, these communities were thought of as spirit-led communities, in which each member of the community had a gift from the Holy Spirit and a role to play. There weren't leaders with the authority to make decisions, like pastors, priests, bishops, etc. For Paul, it makes sense, really, the authentic Paul, that there were no established leaders because the end was coming right away. And in such a short term, there was scarcely any need for Paul to organize for the long haul or to think that, wow, the church might be around for decades or centuries. Now, the situation in the pastorals appears more like what develops later in the 2nd century. In the 2nd century, there are all kinds of Christian letters which tell us about one leader over the church. Letters that tell us about a group of elders who serve under that leader and a group of deacons in charge of the physical needs of the community. But that's all in the 2nd century. That's not the 1st century in the time of Paul. Now, what you can see here, if you're looking at this from an evolutionary standpoint, is you can see a very loosely organized church in the letters of the authentic Paul. And then what you see is gradually, after Paul's death, you are moving to a more and more and more organized church. Eventually, this is going to lead, centuries later, to the development of a bishop, one single bishop over all the other bishops, which is then going to lead to one head bishop, which is then going to lead to the Bishop of Rome, who is later going to be known as the Pope. That's the trajectory all this is taking. But again, that's well beyond Paul's day. But the pastorals are sort of an evolution along the line of thinking here in church hierarchy. Something else, and this may be the most important thing, is the different situation of the pastorals and Paul's authentic letters is very much reflected in the attitude of the author of the pastoral epistles toward women. In many respects, the attitude that Paul has towards women in the 7 letters he wrote versus the pastoral epistles, night and day. Again, according to the author of the pastoral epistles, women are to have no leadership roles in the church. No exceptions. They're not to speak. They aren't to serve as bishops or deacons. Well, what about Paul's own churches? Now, if you go back and you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 through 35, and you compare it with 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, this infamous text, they're going to sound alike. Both of these texts seem to suggest that women shouldn't speak in the church, but the vast majority of critical scholars will tell you that 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 through 35, was not written by Paul. It's a later interpolation, it's a later insertion into 1 Corinthians. It likely came from a scribe who wanted 1 Corinthians to sound more like the pastoral epistles. I say that because in some of the earliest manuscripts of 1 Corinthians, these verses aren't there, or they're in a different place, or they move around. There's even some indication that some scribes even made notations saying, we're not sure these are the authentic words of Paul. Various texts, in other words, demonstrate the likelihood that 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35 are not part of the original 1 Corinthians. In fact, the easiest way to explain this is to say, if you go look at the text of 1 Corinthians itself, Paul grants women the right to speak out in church services in 1 Corinthians 11. He tells them they can pray and prophesy. So either Paul is contradicting himself in 1 Corinthians, or the authentic Paul thought it was completely fine for women to pray and prophesy and speak in church, and it's the Paul of the pastoral epistles that thinks this is wrong. In other places, in other letters, Paul actually affirms that women can and are in fact leaders in the church. In Romans chapter 16, a very important text, a very important chapter, Paul mentions women missionaries like Prisca and Persis. He also talks about a woman deacon of the church named Phoebe. And then, most startling of all, he talks about a woman named Junia, whom he calls foremost among the apostles, which means, if you take that literally, there was at least one female apostle. So unlike the pastoral epistles, Paul's writings, they all endorse the active leadership of women in the church. And this, for me, is a big reason for saying there's no way Paul wrote 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Well, to sum up what's going on here and to conclude, once you get to the pastoral epistles, somewhere either late in the 1st century, probably early 2nd century, the church is becoming highly organized, and it's changing. And women, sadly, I think, were being pushed to the margins. This is a clear trend in early Christian communities. It seems like the further you get away from the historical Jesus and the historical Paul, the more hierarchical, the more patriarchal the church has become. Jesus had a number of women followers. You can see this throughout the various gospel traditions. This would fit the criterion of embarrassment because it would be very unusual for a Jewish rabbi to be teaching women, but there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that the historical Jesus did have female disciples. Paul himself, as I pointed out, seems to have supported women in the church and calls one of them an apostle, which is what he calls himself. Women's influence in the churches was likely justified on the grounds that churches met in private homes. So nobody outside in a city like Corinth or Ephesus would have known what was going on. And most women in the Greco-Roman world, their place was in the home. Husbands outside, women inside. So if you're meeting in small house churches, small homes, perhaps that's why Paul, the authentic Paul, thought this was okay. But as the church grew, people started to realize, one, that Christians were not Jews, and two, that the church was now not a private thing, it was a public thing. And men may have started to grow very uncomfortable with allowing women to exercise authority over them. They may not have wanted others in the Roman Empire, other men, to see that within these churches women had power over men, or that women were equal to men. So by the 2nd century, it appears that women were shut out of authority roles altogether in most of the Christian circles. The Pastoral Epistles presuppose that 2nd century context. They presuppose that later context, and they tend to indicate that the author wrote these letters in response, kind of fictitiously urging under the name of Paul that the churches build up their internal hierarchies to be equipped to face the new challenges of their day, that is, the challenges of the 2nd century. And in reality, what you start to see from the Pastoral Epistles on is these Christian churches looking more and more and more and more like structures in the Roman Empire, the Roman house, the Roman Senate, etc.